George Martin, welcome to 7:30.
I'm glad to be here.
Is your life a testament to the fact that there is actually a value in daydreaming?
Actually, yes, I think it is. I've been daydreaming and night dreaming my entire life, from my childhood in Bayonne, New Jersey. I grew up in the projects in Bayonne, New Jersey. My father was a longshoreman. We didn't have much money. Didn't even own a car. I lived in a world that was 5 blocks long, from First Street, where we lived, to Fifth Street, where I went to school. I would walk those 5 blocks, but very seldom went anywhere beyond those 5 blocks. But Bayonne, New Jersey, my hometown, was a peninsula, and there was a Deepwater Channel right across the street from me, where the big ships would go from Newark Bay to New York Bay, with all the different flags, Australian flags and New Zealand and Scandinavia and China and Liberia. And I would dream about being on those ships and where they were going. And at a very early age, I started reading comic books, and then science fiction and fantasy books, and then books of all sorts. And even though I lived within those 5 blocks, my mind went to other planets and the Middle Ages and the Roman Empire and fantasy kingdoms with J.R. Tolkien and Robert E. Howard. And I became known as George, who had his nose in a book. Always, at any function, I always had a book with me to read.
Who was your favorite comic book character?
Boy, it's hard. I was there for the beginning of the Marvel age, so I think it was the Marvel character. Spider-Man. Spider-Man was very much like me. We were in high school together, me and Spidey, and then we both got out of high school and went to college right about the same time. And of course, I got out of college in about 4 years. Spidey stayed for 20. But
slow learner.
But I liked the Fantastic Four a lot too. The first thing of mine ever published was a letter in the Fantastic Four, number 20. If you want to look that up, I said basically, Shakespeare, move over, Stan Lee has arrived.
That no doubt will become a collector's item. What was the first fantasy style story you can remember reading?
Reading? It was probably Robert E. Howard. It was an anthology called Swords and Sorcery, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. Paperback anthology that I found on the spinner racks. We didn't have any bookstores in Bayonne, so I didn't go to a bookstore for most of my young life. I bought all my books in the spinner racks, the wire spinner racks in the local candy store right next to the comic books, and all the genres were mixed together there, so I never knew what I was going to get. Very little fantasy was being published in the late 50s, early 60s. It was all, in terms of imaginative literature, it was all science fiction. But when I saw this book, Swords and Sorcery by de Camp, it looked interesting. And there were a number of great stories in that book, classics of fantasy storytelling, including a Conan story by Robert E. Howard, which was the first time I'd read one of those, and that one really grabbed hold of me and shook me up. Howard was a pure, visceral storyteller of the first rank.
Now, you must, by the age of 13, have been reading Tolkien, though, because as your confirmation name, you choose Richard, which means you get RR in the centre of your name.
That was actually largely coincidence. It was picked after a cousin. But yes, I did come on Tolkien a couple years after Howard. Tolkien at that time was not legally published in the United States. A publisher named Ace Books discovered that Tolkien's British publisher had made a mistake in the copywriting of the material that allowed a loophole. So he published these unauthorized paperback editions of Tolkien, who didn't approve of paperbacks and wasn't going to allow any. So these cheap paperback editions came up, and I was a big Robert E. Howard fan by then, so I grabbed them. I heard they were something similar. At first, I didn't know about it. I remember reading and saying, "What are these little people with hairy feet? Where's the big barbarian with the sword? Where are the giant snakes? Where's all of that?" But by the time we got to Bree and Rivendell and the Nazgul appeared, the Black Riders, I was completely hooked. And Tolkien had a profound effect on me. He was, I read that book and waited what seemed an endless period of time for the next volume to come out, and eagerly seized it, and I couldn't. It was almost painful that the story was ending, because I didn't want the story ever to end.
One of the interesting things, the difference between you and Tolkien, though, is that religion figures in your books, and it doesn't really in Tolkien's. And Tolkien, like you, is a Catholic, and he actually translated the Catholic version, or one of the books, the Catholic versions of the Bible. It's an interesting omission from his books, but it's in yours.
Yes, it's a strange contradiction because Tolkien was a profoundly religious man. He was a devout Catholic. While I was raised Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore. I'm an agnostic or an atheist or whatever. But I do recognize the enormous importance of religion in human history, and particularly in a medieval world, which my world of Westeros is very much based on the real life Middle Ages, when the power of the Church was gigantic. They were pretty much equal to the state as one of the things that really shaped society and culture and the governance of men. So I think you had to include that. Now, there are religious underpinnings in Tolkien's world, the Maya and the Veda and all of the sort of quasi-godlike figures who created the world. Melkor, Sauron was originally the apprentice of Morgoth, who was Melkor, who was like an archangel and all that. So there's a little bit of Paradise Lost in there. The Miltonian influences, I think, underlie that, and you see that much more clearly in the Silmarillion than you do in Lord of the Rings. You're not going to see that in my books. There's lots of references to gods, but I don't plan to bring them on stage and to demonstrate that they have any actual tangible reality.
Well, take us to Game of Thrones. When did you first start imagining this world?
1991. I remember it very vividly. It was the summer of 1991. I was working a lot in Hollywood at the time. I'd been on a couple shows as a writer-producer on Twilight Zone revival, on Max Headroom, on Beauty and the Beast. And I was doing development, trying to come up with my own concepts for pilots, but I didn't have any immediate assignments in the summer of '91. So I said, let me write a novel. It's been 4 or 5 years since I had my last novel out, and I started this science fiction novel that I'd begun, been planning for years, and it was going pretty well. I was like 40, 50 pages into it when suddenly the idea for the first chapter of Game of Thrones came to me, the chapter where they find the direwolf pups in the summer snows. And I knew right from the beginning that they were summer snows. That phrase was one of the germs, and that there's something wrong in this world with the seasons, and that these direwolves were important, and that each one would have a connection with one of the children of the leading family. And I didn't know much more than that, but I sat down and I put the other book aside. I've never returned to it, and I started writing that chapter, and it just poured out of me in about 3 days. And by the time I'd finished it, I knew what the second chapter would be, and I went on to that, and then the third chapter, and so on and so forth.
What I love through the first book is that constant reference to the Starks is that winter is coming. It's like death in human life. It's something that stands just outside your experience at the moment, but you know that there is something grim and black, and it lies ahead.
Yes, that's those stark words have a certain grimness to them. I've always been struck by the symbolic significance of winter in human affairs, and of course in the world of Westeros, the seasons are not the predictable things they are in our world. They can last for years or even decades, so the coming of winter can be a far more devastating thing than even the coming of winter in our world.
Power is an enormously significant thing in this, in the way that it's wielded. Really, that's one of the things that I really like about the book, is that it's the enduring things in human life that figure so large in them. It's power, it's family, it's love, it's duty, and it's honour. But the characters in your books as well are very human. They're frail, they get burned, they get broken, they die, which again doesn't happen in a lot of other fantasy books.
It does in the good ones, but yes, unfortunately, there's a lot of bad fantasy out there. But there's a lot of bad stuff in every genre. But I think that these are the important issues, love and death and mortality, all of these things that I think artists have been struggling with since Homer first began to tell his stories. And those are the important issues that I want to write about. I mean, Faulkner, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech many years ago, said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself, and I've always taken that as my mantra. And I think that's not just true for Faulkner's fiction or literary fiction in general, but it's true for all fiction, be it science fiction, fantasy, mystery novels, historical fiction, what have you. and the human heart in conflict with itself is the soul of all great stories.
Interesting thing about Ned Stark is that I might have thought that he might die, but given this is 7 books long and the first book is 700 pages long, I thought he might have made it out of the first book. Is it at least a little difficult to cure that character? And he, of course, is the really chivalrous one. He's the one who is bound by his sense of honour. As much as there is a really good character, and they're all flawed in your book, but he seems to be the one.
Yeah, I like great characters. I like people who have both good and evil in them, because I think real people have both good and evil. There are very few pure paladins in the world, and there are very few totally evil people. We all have the capacity for heroism in us. We all have the capacity for selfishness and evil in us. So what it comes down to my mind, is the difficulty of making choices. And someone with like Ned, who has a code that he lives by, and yet he's forced to make some very difficult choices. How do you play this Game of Thrones, this cutthroat game? Do you play it clean and noble, according to the rules that you've been taught? You do that, you could very well lose your life, and you could lose the lives of people that you love, and your family or your children, because the other people that you're playing with are not playing by the same rules. So then, do you compromise your principles and get down and dirty with them, and play it in the rough and mean way that you think might be necessary to win? Well, then maybe you survive a little longer, but what have you become in the end? I mean, these are issues that I think are very much worth talking about, not only in fiction, but of course we see this reflected all around us in the real world. The constant struggle of ideals versus realpolitik. What do you do? What does the leader do? The person who is in a position of power or authority.
Well, Machiavelli said there's no morals in politics. Do you agree with that? Because most of your characters would appear to adhere to that worldview.
I think Machiavelli was describing a reality, but I think it's a reality that we have to fight against. I suppose. I think there is room for idealism in politics. I can admire the realism and the intellectual insight of Machiavelli, but I also respond to the idealism of a Woodrow Wilson, who dared to dream of a war to end war, and let's have a League of Nations and settle all our differences peacefully by sitting at a table and talking. That goes against the entire history of the human race up to then, but it's a goal worth striving for, I think. And if we don't strive to perfect ourselves as societies or as human beings, then we'll never get beyond where we are now. And I do think if you look at history, and I read a lot of history, as violent and dangerous as the world is now, we're better off than we were in the Dark Ages or certain other periods of history. There has been a moral evolution that has taken place.
One of the really interesting characters in your book, I think perhaps the most interesting character, is Tyrion the dwarf, the imp who actually, from the moment that he's born, is dealt a rough hand by life, but he manages through his wit, really, to survive, and his intellect. He's been badly abused by life. He's cynical, but he is, as you say, he's a very mixed character. He's not without a lot of redeeming features, particularly his sense of humour.
I think we all need a sense of humor to get us through the vicissitudes of life here. If we can't laugh at ourselves and at the situations we find ourselves in, then ultimately it's all going to crush us.
And the women in your book as well are very powerful characters. They wield their power sometimes in a different way, sometimes through their sex, sometimes through their womb, but they are as brutal as the men when it comes to making those decisions about power.
Yeah, I'm fortunate in that I have a cast of thousands, literally. So I have been able to create a number of different women characters. People have interviewed me before and asked me about the creation of a woman character. I don't sit down and say, now I am going to create a woman character who is somehow standing in for all women or even a significant subset of women. I try to create individual characters. So, Arya is very different from her sister Sansa, and both of them are different from their mother, and their mother is different from Cersei Lannister, the head of, who's different from the Queen of Thorns, the head of the Tyrell family, and Daenerys Targaryen, the exiled princess, is different from all of them, and that's, I take my pride in that, in making characters who are not generalizations, but who are individuals, each one with their own strengths and weaknesses, their own dreams and desires, their own fears and doubts.
Do you have a favourite character?
Tyrion's probably my favorite character, but I love them all. They're all my
You're not
children.
gonna kill him, are you?
So, and no one is safe. No one is safe. I make no promises.
One of the things, again, that's interesting about the book is it starts out like a medieval tale with magic as a rumour, as it would have been, something, again, that's in the distance. It's not really towards the end of the first book that magic becomes a reality.
Well, that's when the dragons come on stage, when the eggs hatch, But, if you look at the real history of the Middle Ages, we can look back at them as sophisticated modern men and saying, oh, those primitive people, they believed in all this sorcery and things, but they did believe in it. So from their point of view, it was real. They lived in a world where there were dragons maybe over the next hill. They hadn't seen them, but they knew someone who knew someone who had seen them, and they found their bones, which we know now were probably like dinosaur bones or the bones of an aurochs or some prehistoric beast that is gone, but they thought they were dragon bones. They believed in witches. They believed in spells. They believed you could kiss a frog and cure warts, and these beliefs had power to them. So in some ways it's not terribly different between medieval England and medieval Westeros.
Just a couple more things. How has the series changed what you do as a writer now?
It hasn't. The series, we're about to debut season 4. So we started a couple years before that. So, the series has been part of my life for about 6 years now, but the books go back to 1991. These characters and the story is so much a part of me for so large a period of my life that the relative Johnny-come-lately of the series, it can't budge them from me. Now, I recognize that's not true for the viewers. I mean, for the viewers, even people who read the books, Tyrion is now and forever Peter Dinklage, and Arya is now and forever Maisie Williams. But the characters that live in my head are different.
The series is very true to the book.
Yes, very much so.
And you've got a lot of control over what happens with the series.
Oh, I wouldn't say I have a lot of control, but I have a voice. I write the books. David Benioff and Dan Weiss are the showrunners. They write the majority of the scripts. I do one script per season, but I consult with them pretty regularly, and they are doing quite a faithful adaptation so far, and I've been very excited and pleased about what it's done. And among other things, of course, it's getting me millions of new readers for the books, because the people who watch the show then go out and buy the books, and I'm all in favor of that.
Now, of course, on the books, the question all your fans want to know is, when will the next one be out?
When will the next one be out? Well, that's a good question. I was asked at the Supernova Convention this weekend in Brisbane, when will your next book be out? And my answer was December. But it's a book called Dangerous Women that I edited with my friend Gardner Dozois. And it does have an Ice and Fire novella in it, though. A novella I wrote called The Princess and the Queen, about a Targaryen civil war 150 years before the events of the main books. 30,000 words of Targaryens and dragons fighting. So that will have to appease them until I finish The Winds of Winter, which is still a ways. I mean, these books are enormous. They take me a long time to write.
Now, you are very interested in American politics, obviously. Would Congress be improved by the addition of a few swords, if you threw them in there at the moment?
Oh, believe me, there are days when I'd like to wade in there with a war hammer and get some things done. It's very frustrating in the United States right now. It's almost like our political system is broken. We've always had this elaborate system of checks and balances, but the checks have overwhelmed the balances, and there's no balance anymore. There's just a check that prevents anything from getting done. and it gives every aspect of being a broken system. So I hope the next election or two we can change that. But right now, boy.
So if you could behead anyone in Congress, who would it be?
I probably shouldn't
Have you got a
say.
list?
I do have a list. Yeah, I do have a list, but they might not let me back in the country.
So what do you imagine for your future? Obviously, continuing, you've got to finish this series, and then beyond that.
I have 2 more Eisenfire books to do. They're, as I say, enormous, so they're going to take me a few years. I'm also writing a prequel series about these 2 characters called Dunk and Egg, who lived 100 years before the events of Eisenfire in Westeros. I've written 3 big novellas about them. We've collected those. That book will be out next year, but I want to write another 10 stories about those 2 characters, follow them through their whole life. I also have lots of stories, lots of ideas in my files for stories completely unconnected with Westeros. Science fiction novels and contemporary novels, mystery novels, short stories. I mean, I began my career back in the 70s writing a lot of short stories. I miss writing short stories. There's not much money in it, but it's a wonderful art in and of itself. I'd like to, at some point, go back and do a whole bunch more short stories.
One of the things that I notice about your book, though, is it's really very well written. It's very crisp. The books might be long, but words aren't wasted in it. You work a long time on your writing style?
Oh, yes. I rewrite constantly, yeah. So I can, there's a multiple viewpoint structure in that where I have like 10 viewpoints that I switch between, and every time I change voices, it's always a bit of a bump. I'm putting aside Tyrion, now I'm getting into a Jon Snow chapter. I reread the last 3 or 4 Jon Snow chapters to get his voice in my head, and in the act of rereading, I inevitably rewrite, so I wound up polishing those chapters again. So there's a progressive polishing going on with all of the chapters, yeah. Someone asked me at Supernova this weekend, what's the hard part of writing? And my answer was the words. The words are hard.
So, look, you began your life as a daydreaming boy. Does your life seem like a daydream now?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. But it's worked out pretty well. And I don't think I'd change much of anything.
Well, George Martin, thank you very much for speaking with us on 7:30.
Oh, my pleasure. I was thrilled to be here.